Well, let's chat a bit about that testimony now. News 24 senior legal journalist Karyn Maughan and political analyst Sanusha Naidu join me now live. Ladies, a very good evening to you. Thanks indeed for your time. Karyn, let me start with you. Where it all started, another attempt today to halt those proceedings before we actually got to the testimony. Briefly talk us through what happened there.
Well, essentially, the advocates representing a number of those people who have been implicated, including Arthur Fraser, really, expressing a great deal of unhappiness over the fact that there would be evidence led in which they could be potentially implicated, but they hadn't been given notice of their potential implication. They also had fundamental issues with the fact that she was giving evidence, essentially corroborating Mr. Y's testimony in question, why she could not simply file a confirmatory affidavit as that confirmation, and then this affidavit could be submitted. But I think the pivotal point here is that Mr. Y is been, as we've heard from evidence leader Paul Pretorius, recovering from a coma, and it's very clear that the inquiry wants the public to hear what he had to say, and Ms. K was effectively used as a vehicle for that. What we saw today was essentially Paul Pretorius reading out Mr. Y's affidavit and Ms. K, in many respects, confirming it and adding extra details because of the role she had played in that investigation.
Karyn, front companies where SSA funds were channeled to, and according to Ms. K, the abuse occurred from the top. The names of former ministers also mentioned. Is there any recourse here? Can any of those individuals be held personally liable if there is evidence to suggest such?
Absolutely. And we know from Ms. K's evidence, and this was, made very clear by Advocate Pretorius, that this information has been submitted to the Hawks. It has been submitted to the NPA's investigating directorate, which is specifically tasked with investigating so-called state capture matters. Certainly in respect of Minister Mthlobo, if these averments are correct, that he in fact essentially served as a conduit for SSA to fund former President Jacob Zuma in the amount of millions of rands, a total estimated value of 84 million rand, then that amounts to fraud and theft from the fiscus. And certainly, if there's evidence to that effect, they must and can be pursued.
Sanusha, with what has come to light over the past couple of days, one begs to ask the question whether there should be a debate in South Africa and even globally on the state security architecture.
Good evening, Griselda and Karyn and the viewers. I mean, it's a debate that's been happening. It's an ongoing debate about where the role of information sharing, transparency, accountability, investigation happens with regard to the global architecture on state security agencies. It's not a pretty debate. It's very controversial in many ways because a lot of the work that the state security agencies do across the globe are basically lumped under this notion of the national security interest. And of course, it cannot be divulged because it can compromise the national security interest of the state. I think that's a very broad term. We need to be clearer and have more cohesiveness around what does the national security interest mean when it actually is in the national security interest of the state. Now, this is an ongoing debate, and I think part of this is also dealing with, for example, the Julian Assange issue with regard to how do you declassify information. I think if you look at the Cold War and you look at the number of what we would call memos and different types of information documents that have been declassified. Information that was once classified has now been declassified. It takes a while before that information can get into the public domain. But I think what is very, very concerning when I listen to the testimony and listen to the evidence presented at the State Capture Commission is that you have a parallel set of institutions, a parallel state actually involved here. It's a deep state. It's a state that doesn't have any accountability. They work in murky ways. They work in shadows. They work in, we talk about agents, do we classify these people as agents? I mean, every state has this, but then this state, this kind of parallel set of institutions, architecture, systems become a law unto themselves. And everything that gets lumped under this broad banner of national security or national interest doesn't mean that these people are actually working in the national interest of the state. I think the evidence presented by two protected witnesses show that it was done with very particular goals in mind, very particular objectives. And for me, what's also very interesting is that if you bring it back to South Africa, it's actually a cotton on, if not a carry through, around how the national security management system worked under P.W. Botha. But it's also the way liberation movements worked in security architecture in exile. And for me, when I think about the years of the Jacob Zuma presidency, it's just a complete cut, copy, and paste of the playbook of exile.
I mean, from what we've heard now, this certainly seems like it's the tip of the iceberg. We've always heard of so-called dodgy dealings through tenders, and I spoke to you a bit earlier about this, Sanusha, but what we are seeing now here is what you had described as a dark shadow state from what we can say is the unaccountable sector.
Yeah, definitely, Criselda. This is a sector where, and listening to what Karyn is saying, I mean, all this evidence that is being presented before the Zondo Commission has to have a paper trail. And the really difficult part of this world of state security agents and parallel security apparatus and frameworks and money that's been carried out in briefcase or in book bags and put into it. There's nothing that actually that brings you a paper trail. And if you think about that in the context of South Africa, I think this tip of the iceberg means that the terms of reference of the Zondo Commission, I think after this Zondo Commission completes its recommendation and the report, definitely needs to start thinking about what the Sydney Mafamadi panel on investigating the state security agency needs to go forward, because we have laws and legal instruments in South Africa, which is like PIA, the promotion of access to information, the whole question of the Right to Know campaign. We got the Political Party Funding Act, which has been operationalized. And of course, if this is what the money was being used to protect a faction in the ruling party, to protect Luthuli House, to use the money of the state in this way for a political party, this means that we've got to now rethink how does these different legislation that we have before us in terms of our constitution can be amplified to get away from what could be a constitutional issue that says, oh, you can't put this in the public domain because it compromises the state security of the country. Not necessarily so. This is basically protecting a faction of people who want to have political power. And again, the media as well has been implicated. Certain actors in the media have been implicated in this. So if all this money was to create a propagandist machine, it has to come to the fore. And I think this is definitely an important recommendation for the Zondo Commission to say we need to investigate this parallel state that exists.
And that's exactly my next question. Karyn, I wanted to talk about the South African National Editors Forum calling for an investigation and transparency on these claims, of SSA funding for media houses, the African News Agency, ANA, coming out in that. How dangerous is this and damaging for the media industry, both for you and I guess?
Well, what is remarkable is that ANA has come out and effectively admitted that, yes, they did get money from SSA to write positive stories about the South African government, but saying that this was never part of any nefarious plot. There is so much problematic with that statement, not least of all that if you do this form of bizarre advertorial on behalf of the state security agency, you should declare it. That clearly did not happen. So astounding sort of revelations coming from ANA in regards to this. But I think the pivotal question here is, what is the ANC saying in response to this? There are clear averments from senior SSA officials that money that was supposedly destined for intelligence purposes, and we forget, intelligence is meant to safeguard you and I from terrorist attacks, from xenophobic attacks, from civil uprisings caused by service delivery. We haven't seen any of that kind of protection coming from the SSA. Instead, we find out via the Mufamadi affidavit and the evidence given by JAFTA and the witnesses that will follow that in fact units of the SSA were busy disrupting Cyril Ramaphosa's election campaign and proudly, allegedly reporting it to Arthur Fraser, that there were reports about disrupting Zuma Must Fall protests. This is not within the ambit of what responsible state security should be doing. And certainly I would agree with Sanusha that this culture of secrecy, specifically around spending, leads itself to the kind of rampant abuses that we are hearing about that have been alleged by these very senior witnesses.
And that's a point I think that needs to be made. Sanusha, testimony, Karyn alluding to it there about monies and Lutuli House. I mean, where's the ANC in all of this?
I haven't heard much. I think muted at this point, given the number of different fires they are fighting on different fronts. But I think it actually opens up a space in terms of the kind of civil society, the role that the media has been playing in opening up the Chapter 9 institutions, and particularly the Public Protector's Office, that this needs to be investigated. It compromises not just the security of you and I, it compromises the democratic integrity of the state. And this is why we have this constitution, and this is why we have Chapter 9 institutions, in particular the Public Protector's Office. I think even the Public Protector has been blindsided by her own indiscretions around these issues and biasness around these things. Because at the end of the day, if we are opening ourselves up to different types of national security threats to our borders, to the safety and security of the citizens of South Africa, but we are basically using money to fight political battles and different kinds of factional battles within the party, that then compromises the entire ambit of what the objective of a state security agency is. Let me also be clear that around the world, this is not an exception that South Africa finds itself. Right. Around the world, that the state security agencies have always had this very, very difficult, if not compromising and contradictory role within the context of what constitutes national security interest and what is defined as the national interest. I know in South Africa, there are these documents that exist. I think they need to be dusted off the shelves and brought back into understanding this role of national security and the state security agencies. But again, what really scares me is that a lot of this information gets redacted in terms of how it's presented, that it's not going to be in the public interest, that it's not, we want to safeguard this. I think at one point there were lots of tensions emerging around the world about what is the role of agents in the field with regard to the end of the Cold War. Where is the threat coming from? And now we've got new security threats, new urban threats that are happening, in terms of the intra-security instabilities that exist from within the state, as opposed to interstate security threats. But again, if this is what the mandate was, then you have in the states of South Africa and perhaps elsewhere, where a parallel institution was set up to actually spy on their own state security institution.
Yeah. And you know what comes to mind here, Karyn, is that in our daily reportage, what has come across from government is that there is no money to cushion some of the poorest of the poor while we are in the middle of a pandemic. Is there enough money for these vaccines that are so needed? And we ask the question then, can these billions be recovered?
Well, I mean, it's such an interesting point that you raise, and it really goes to the heart of this. I mean, it emerged in the Auditor General's 2017-2018 report that SSA had 9 billion rands of assets that it simply couldn't trace. He didn't know where they were. Now, we saw Arthur Fraser's advocate coming out today and saying, no, he's been informed by SSA that these assets are not lost. Who knows? At this point, the official record is that they are indeed absent. But we have a situation where, as a country, we are now considering a tax hike in order to fund the 20 billion rand that is needed to vaccinate our population against COVID-19. And at least nearly half of that money could have been supplied by these assets that apparently are now may or may not be missing. So it really hits hard, this apparent looting, wastage of money in the context of a country that's been defined as the most unequal in the world, where 57% of people are living in poverty, and the consequences of COVID-19 have forced this country into a significant recession from which people are suffering in dire and severe circumstances. So it's not just about the ANC's factions utilizing state machinery to score points against each other and to try and retain power of the country. It's about a real and lived impact on the poorest of the poor, and it borders on treasonous in its effects on our most vulnerable people.
Sanusha, we're fast running out of time, but perhaps is there anything that could come out of such damning testimony? Yes, I guess we've heard it all, but what we continue to hear in terms of the use of these state apparatus is that these institutions are being used to score points against different factions within the ANC, and the bottom line is that the general populace of this country are the ones who have to suffer and take flak for it at the end of the day. Is there anything tangible, or if anyone could be held accountable for this?
It's a difficult one to say. I think with the way the architecture of the state security agencies work, they have a lot of what you call in international relations immunity, diplomatic immunity. And you find that in international relations, diplomatic immunity becomes the draw card for everybody if they don't want to be held accountable. I think this murky world of the state security agency is one that it's going to take a long while to basically chip away at that iceberg and go right to the bottom of that and see where these assets are. But I have to agree with Karyn, in a country where we are basically surviving at the margins, where over 60 or 70% of people are surviving at the margins and they don't have running water, better housing, access to good service delivery, to see this money being used in such a frivolous way for such difficulty, I think is just completely ludicrous, but of course completely lack of any consciousness and any kind of ethical and moral governance structure. And I think to a large extent, if you want to hike the tax of people to pay for the COVID vaccine, you're sitting on another powder keg, which I think the State Security Agency is not prepared to deal with because they just don't have the capacity to do so.
Political analyst Sanusha Naidu and News 24 senior legal journalist Karyn Maughan, thank you very much for joining us this evening.